Welcome to this episode of The Common Sense Skeptic, which will be dissecting the recent video made by the Angry Astronaut, herein referred to as simply Angry, where he railed against this Jeff Bezos declaration towards Elon Musk.
My friends who want to move to Mars, I say, I have an idea for you. Why don't you first, for a year, move to the top of Mount Everest? Because the top of Mount Everest is a garden paradise compared to Mars.
Angry also associates Bill Nye with this mindset because the science guy is no fool when it comes to the dangers that Mars holds for would-be colonists.
And I say to everybody who thinks that they, or everybody, he or she, who thinks he or she wants to colonize Mars, go colonize Antarctica. No. None of this going to the seashore where the penguins are swimming and the orca. No, go to the dry valleys. It hasn't snowed or rained in a century. And there's nothing to eat, and see what you think.
In response, Angry made this video with a great many claims about how he believes Bezos and Nye are wrong in their beliefs. But as you'll see shortly, most of Angry's video really doesn't hold up to any scrutiny at all. In fact, you can't even get through his opening sequence without tripping over half a dozen mistakes. In rapid fire, here's the highlights.
Mars was actually a very habitable place for some time in its ancient past.
There is no proof that Mars was habitable. There is proof there was once water, and a suspicion that it had an atmosphere 4 billion years ago that was lost when the core of the planet cooled, but declaring it was very habitable is certainly not a wildly held belief based on available evidence.
Mars was once covered in water, and that water did not all bleed off into space.
Being covered in water in the past doesn't make something habitable now. You know what else used to be covered by an ocean of water? The middle of the Sahara Desert. From 50 to 100 million years ago, the Sahara was home to some of the largest sea creatures in the world. Today, it's an expanse of sand measuring 9.2 million square kilometers, roughly the size of the US, with a sparse population of 2 people for every 5 square kilometers. And those are highly adapted people. Most people dropped into the middle of the Sahara expanse would be dead in less than 3 days.
Trillions upon trillions of tons of water ice remain just below the surface all over the planet.
Every expert has their own assessment of the amount of water left on Mars, and digging for it has not yielded great results. 1 trillion tons of water sounds like a huge volume of water, when it is in fact a fraction of the water found in just the Canadian Great Lakes. There was a single iceberg that was cracked off of the Larsen Sea ice shelf that weighed 1 trillion tons. And while it was large enough to be easily tracked from space, it was a smaller footprint than Delaware, and finding Delaware on a globe is a neat trick, unless you know exactly where to look. Here are the facts. For water or any other liquid to remain in its liquid state, the temperature and atmospheric pressure must be balanced. If the temperature goes up, or if the pressure affecting the liquid drops, it will begin to boil. And that's why water will boil at about 70 degrees Celsius at the top of Everest, compared to 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. Because the atmospheric pressure on Mars is not great enough to force water to remain in its liquid state, it is more likely that surface water boiled off and bled off as the atmospheric pressure dropped, rather than sank into the regolith. We do know that Mars has ice caps at its poles. It is suggested that these ice reservoirs could contain 5 million cubic kilometers of water ice. Again, 5 million cubic kilometers sounds like a massive reserve, until you compare it to the 1.386 billion cubic kilometers of water on Earth. So Mars has roughly 1/3 of 1% of what Earth has in its biosphere.
That water ice is all we need in order to be able to survive long term.
Completely inaccurate. It is one of many compounds we need to find on Mars before that's going to happen. Another one of the things we desperately need to find on Mars is nitrogen, because atmospheric nitrogen makes up 78% of the air we breathe, and it's an absolute requirement of growing plants. Mars's atmospheric nitrogen is almost completely absent, and you can't make nitrogen from water or carbon dioxide. It's an element, and it's either on Mars or it's not. Right now, it is not looking good.
Everest is a beautiful but horrifying place with extremely powerful winds, as you can see here, that would blow away any habitat you tried to put on top of it.
Well, it seems that most people that travel to the Himalayas to climb to the summit of Everest bring little more than a pup tent, so that argument dies pretty quick. And that's probably the first time anyone has ever described the summit of Everest as horrifying.
Plus, it's home to killer avalanches that have ended the lives of so many people who have attempted to scale it, and Mars has none of these characteristics.
As it turns out, that's not exactly true. Angry seems to be unaware that the orbiting NASA satellite called Reconnaissance has captured many avalanches of ice and dust on Mars. In fact, NASA has recently released images from the Reconnaissance orbiter that quite clearly shows an avalanche of ice and dust tumbling down a 500-meter high valley wall. A year ago, they released a similar video, and there are others going back at least 13 years showing similar incidents, so Mars is not exactly an avalanche-free zone. Further, there hasn't been an avalanche-related death on Everest since 2015, and that incident was triggered by a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. Also, the people who died in that event were located at the base camp, not at the summit.
This water is gone, but it isn't gone into space. It's beneath the surface, ready for us to use.
Since we've already argued why this is unlikely, let's now say it is true that all of the water is trapped below the surface. What are the chances it's going to be fresh water? The Earth is covered by water across 75% of its face. Most of it is salt water that will kill you if you drink it. We already know that the surface of Mars is contaminated with toxic perchlorate salts, so it would not be at all surprising to find the frozen ice at the poles is also contaminated in this fashion. Desalinization of seawater on Earth is a very costly venture requiring a great deal of energy, and Mars is notoriously energy poor. But that's not even the greatest challenge. Mining that ice is going to present tremendous challenges. Has anybody watched the Discovery Channel show called Gold Rush? They have some pretty heavy-duty equipment on that show, and not even the most powerful Caterpillar tractors have any effect on permafrost or frozen ground. These excavation machines have one or more giant claws at the back end of them called a ripper, the function of which is to rip the ground surface before excavating it. But if they try ripping apart permafrost or other frozen ground, they can tear that steel appendage clean off with little effort, and blades and buckets just skip right over the top of the frozen layer as well. Ground frost is tough slugging. Anybody who has tried digging a new post hole in the middle of winter knows exactly how rough it is on your tools and on your body. So hand tools probably aren't the way to go either, especially when colonists will require tons of water for various uses on a daily basis. No matter what solution they use to attempt to liberate water from the Martian regolith, it's not going to be an easy chore. But considering this absolutely needs to be figured out before humans can be sent to Mars, especially if they are relying on in situ fuel production, it would be interesting to see what the actual plans are for such a resource recovery. And that takes us up to his opening credits. In the first segment of his actual presentation, Angry wonders where we would live, and he seems to think that most people don't consider shelter to be top of mind.
Now, perhaps shelter isn't the first thing on everyone's list when it comes to surviving on another planet, but it's on mine.
Shelter should be at the forefront of everybody's mind because it is at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy pyramid. Now listen to the very next clip.
If you don't have adequate shelter against the Martian environment, you're dead.
If you don't have adequate protection from the Martian atmosphere, you're dead. You know what happens if people step outside of their shelter on Everest? Nothing. So that seems like a very early acknowledgement that Jeff was right after all. And the rest of Angry's video is the equivalent of pissing into the wind, but we're going to have some fun with it anyway. Shelter would be one of the first things on anybody's mind if they are serious about taking people to Mars, because shelter, along with food, water, and air, form the bottom layer of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. On Earth, there is a trinity that is often quoted, especially on crime shows such as CSI. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food is all it takes to kill you. On Mars, add another one to this. 20 seconds exposed to Mars's atmosphere, you'll have blacked out and will be unable to function, and your chances of revival would be slim since your lungs would have ruptured due to the extremely thin Martian atmosphere. This is a fact that's well known to scuba divers who must never hold their breath while diving, or the same thing will happen to them when they surface. Around the 8:30 mark of his video, Angry starts discussing a habitat concept called the Marsha.
So this is the Marsha, something that I have talked about many times, an interesting design that involves essentially a vertical cylinder, which they discovered was the most efficient use of space and building material.
He is definitely a fan of this design and seems to think that this habitat will all at once make Mars a completely livable planet. But he hasn't done his homework. The cylindrical Marsha habitat was produced by AI Space Factory for a NASA challenge that was issued in 2018 for companies to create a feasible housing solution for Martian colonists living on the surface of Mars, mainly using materials found on the red planet. Even though this concept won the top prize of $500,000 in May of 2019, it is fair to say that the Marsha only met some of the criteria set out in Section 3 of the competition rules. And they state quite clearly that construction materials should be made from indigenous materials. One of the building materials that AI Space Factory used was basalt, and that can be found very close to the surface in certain regions of Mars in proximity to volcanoes. The other material was polylactic acid, which is definitely not found on Mars anywhere. Better known as PLA, polylactic acid is a bioplastic normally derived from plant materials, such as sugarcane, cornstarch, or tapioca root. None of those crops grow on Mars. And on Earth, where we have plenty of such waste to use, PLA pellets made from these materials will run you about $4 a kilo when you purchase them in bulk. For the PLA, Angry postulates that colonists would be able to use waste materials left over from greenhouse crop production. Here's the biggest problem with that thought process. After you harvest a crop, the soil is depleted of nutrients that need to be replenished. Farmers often use compost piles of waste materials and manure to accomplish this, because the next crop benefits greatly from having those nutrients kept in the system. So every kilo of carbon or nitrogen or potassium or calcium that is taken out of the system for use in this plasticizing process is another kilo of something that has to be launched from Earth or mined somehow on Mars. Now, Angry is going to argue that these settlements are going to use aquaponic systems that don't require soil, but we've gone through all of that before with them. Aquaponics use fish in a hydroponic system to produce nitrates and nitrites for the plants to consume. But the compounds can't be created out of thin air. In the case of aquaponics on Earth, the fish are fed those leftover parts of the plants in order to produce the fertilizer that the system needs. But they won't be using aquaponics on Mars for all the reasons that we indicated before in our other videos on the topic. To win the NASA competition, the teams had to produce a proof of concept in real time during a 24-hour period. The claim for AI Space Factory is that this 15-foot flower vase would represent a 1/3 scale model of the final product. You can see from this video that the 3D printer provided a constant supply of material from the nozzle, not unlike a caulking gun, going around and around in a circle, leaving spaces for windows and doors, which would have to be brought from Earth, which is another break in the criteria of only using materials found on Mars. It is worth noting that the AI Space Factory machine did not perform the procedure perfectly in its demonstration. Several ribbons of slurry missed their mark completely, and if this happened during a Mars construction process, it would result in a skin weakness, which is something you definitely do not want to have happen in what will be a pressurized vessel. Keep in mind, this process was conducted at room temperature and in a 1 bar atmosphere, proving they can make this small structure on Earth. If you wanted to prove you can make it on Mars, they needed to remove 99% of the atmosphere and drop the temperature down to about -55 Celsius. But even then, the structure they managed to build was not a 1/3 scale of their CGI promise, and here are just some of the shortcomings. The structure of the walls is completely different. What is shown in the diagrams is a dual wall with interconnecting structural support. What was created was a single wall, no inner wall, and no cross supports or insulating barrier. The CGI mock-up also very definitely printed floors within the habitat. Not only did this live demonstration fail to do this, it is unlikely that the machine is capable of doing this at all. How is this machine supposed to suspend a flat surface across a void without it collapsing, or the material simply falling to the floor in the first place? There are other companies on Earth doing 3D house printings, and you'll notice what they need to do in order to create a floor. They use trusses and plywood like any other home construction. The floors in the Marsha are unlikely to be made of this basalt material as shown in the CGI. In the promotional video for Marsha, they compare the cylindrical shape of their concept against the dome, comparing floor space and usable headroom, etc. to show the cylinder makes better use of the footprint. But they very conveniently leave out the fact that the cylinder requires a staircase to access the different levels, and their concept also uses skylights in the middle of the floor to provide light throughout the structure. As you can see from this diagram, the footprint required for the staircase represents somewhere between 15 and 20% of the floor plan, and the skylight takes up even more floor area. These are both wastes of space. The cylinder they show dimensions for has a diameter of 6.5, presumably meters, and a height of 12 meters, giving it a volume of 383 cubic meters. In comparison, this would be about the floor plan of a single-story bungalow with 142 square meters and an 8-foot ceiling, or about 1,500 square feet, split between either 4 or 5 stories, depending on which model you're looking at. Basalt fiber is heralded many times by Angry in this video as being incredibly strong and radiation resistant. It would be interesting to know where he is drawing that information from. But what we do know is that the tensile strength of basalt fiber is in the neighborhood of 2.8 to 3.1 GPa, has an elastic modulus of 85 to 87 GPa, a 3.15% elongation on break, and a density of 2.67 grams per cubic centimeter. On Wikipedia, they are kind enough to provide comparisons to other materials right underneath those specs. This places basalt fiber in the same region as e-glass fibers on all stats. But you know what's not incredibly strong and radiation resistant? Polylactic acid, the bioplastic binder in the slurry used in this process. One of the biggest issues with using PLA as a shelter material, especially one that's supposed to protect occupants from radiation, is that PLA degrades readily when it is irradiated. The result of radiation exposure is a polymer of lower molecular weight and lesser properties, making it a very poor choice for use as a building material on a planet with no magnetosphere guarding the surface from incoming solar and galactic radiation. Not to worry though, since according to Angry, GCRs only hit the planet's surface during the day, which really demonstrates his level of comprehension on that topic.
And especially during the night, there's no need for water because the sun is down and the presence of cosmic rays and radiation is far lower.
The problem with that is GCRs are omnidirectional and omnipresent, and they come from outside of our solar system, not from the sun. So it doesn't matter what time of day you pump water, people are going to be getting hammered with GCRs. He also mentions at one point of the video that level of radiation on the surface of Mars is roughly equivalent to the radiation aboard the ISS. Again, not the case.
And let me say one more thing about radiation. The radiation levels on the surface of Mars are about the equivalent of the radiation on the ISS.
The ISS, situated at around 400 kilometers from the Earth, is well inside the Earth's Van Allen belts that shield the planet from radiation of all kinds, and therefore the ISS astronauts only receive about 250 times the radiation that people on the surface do, compared to the 700 times radiation expected on Mars. Now going back to basalt, it is not as plentiful on Mars as Angry would have you believe. Mineralization maps of the surface of Mars have established where basalt, an igneous rock, is located on or close to the surface. Basalt does not occur naturally as a fiber. Nobody is taking a shot back to the surface of Mars and bringing home bags of basalt fiber. You might know this material better by another name, Roxol rock wool insulation. It's an insulation alternative to pink fiberglass that has a bunch of benefits in comparison. It repels moisture and rodents and mold. It has good insulating quality, but like all insulations, its effectiveness is in the air it can trap between the layers, more so than what the material is made of. In order to turn this volcanic rock into fibers, it must first go through a blast furnace, with temperatures as high as 1600 degrees Celsius. On Earth, that furnace requires coking coal to achieve temperatures that high. Solar energy is not going to cut it for this task, and each of the habitats is going to require a huge amount of material for each build. After the molten material is heated to temperature, it is spun like cotton candy to create the fibrous sheets that come out of the furnace in a continuous mat. Now for clarification, these sheets of fibers are absolutely not building materials, but when you combine this product with the PLA bioplastic, you get a product similar to fiberglass sheets with resin. Nobody is building 5-story buildings out of fiberglass. Let's for a second pretend that PLA won't decompose and collapse in the exposed conditions of Mars, and let's also pretend that basalt fibers are plentiful and easy to create. That way we can take a look at the interior of this concept, because it really goes to show how all you need to convince people of something is to make a flashy CGI movie about it. This crosscut of the 4-story model of a Marsha shows ceiling heights of between 12 and 16 feet, based on the leaping figure in the top story. And shots like this one, demonstrating a sweeping staircase with steps somewhere between 2 and 3 feet tall, shows an absolute disregard for function. Every cubic foot in that photo is dead unusable space. Around this time, Angry mentions how all of the windows in the Marsha and the giant overhead skylight will have circulating water flowing through them to maximize radiation protection. And there's so many things wrong with that. First off, a skim coat of water, whether it's circulating or not, is going to provide almost no protection against radiation. We've covered several times before how the amount of water required to provide a reasonable 50% protection against GCRs is 5 meters in depth. So the couple of centimeters you might have between these panels is hardly worth the effort of plumbing a circulation system through the entire structure for that purpose. Also, water expands a lot when it freezes, and it's pretty cold on Mars. Burst pipes, pump issues, and a cracked or broken window could all add up to a major headache, and possibly a life-threatening situation. If the failure occurred in the skylight, it would certainly be fatal to anyone in the structure at the time, since there does not appear to be any airlocks in between floors. Back to the interior shots, and although some of them like this shot seem to have some grasp of the size of the footprint with the floor plan, others like this one seem to present it far larger than it would be. The woman fixing her hair in this shot, if she were in the region of 5'6" or about 1.5 meters, would be about 10 to 12 feet or about 4 meters from the door of her sleeping chamber, and that is just not likely. Floor plan per floor would average about 300 square feet or about 30 square meters, giving a radius of this habitat at about 10 feet or 3 meters. And it would be worthwhile at this point to notice the suits attached to the outside wall, so as to keep the toxic Martian regolith dust outside the habitat. We're going to come back to that later. One of the things that we noticed about the CGIs of this concept is that it would appear to be for a single nuclear family, mother, father, and 2 or 3 kids. If anyone is under the impression that the burbs are making their way to the red planet, think again. And the likelihood of everyone getting their own 1,500 square foot, 4 or 5 story building is well below slim to none. Angry wraps up this segment with, "Does this look like living at the top of Mount Everest to you?" It's such a laughable question because if you can build this on Mars, you can build this on Everest for a fraction of the cost. In fact, for the price of what it would cost to launch the windows, skylight, hatches, airlocks, water pumps, and everything else that they can't find on Mars, you could probably finance a couple of these units at the Everest Base Camp. One more thing about the company AI Space Factory before we go. After winning the prize from NASA for their design, in August of 2019, AI Space Factory released some promotional videos and an Indiegogo campaign. It was dedicated to buying a chunk of land and print several similarly designed habitats, called terras, as a bed and breakfast concept, where people could pre-book their stay by contributing to their Indiegogo campaign in advance. 2 years later, the people who were very excited about buying in at the front of the line are now asking the company if they are still in business and waiting to hear back from the company who stopped responding to people over a year ago. Their very convincing CGI video raised a little over $44,000 of the $200,000 they were shooting for, and they have obviously not delivered on their March 2020 delivery goals. Blaming COVID for this would be disingenuous, since it's supposed to be an automated manufacturing process. AISpaceFactory.com's most recent news release was from the New York Times, published in November of 2019. The email address doesn't respond to inquiries, and their address is listed as the 4th floor of 298 Fifth Avenue in New York. Their website doesn't list a phone number, but Crunchbase does. If you want to get in touch with them, their phone number is 912-275-7103. Crunchbase also lists a different email address, which is contact@ai-o.com, which is another CGI website of skyscrapers and architect concepts, declaring it has contacts in Shanghai and Barcelona. According to Google Maps, this graffitied apartment building is their Barcelona office, and their Shanghai address appears to be for a Turkish restaurant called Garlic. So we found it funny how Angry has, by his own admission, mentioned this company many times in his videos and absolutely loves the company and the designs, but he never bothered looking into them at all. And with that, we are going to take a break here because this episode is going a lot longer than we had planned, and we still have half of his video to cut apart. Once part 2 is ready, you'll be able to click the link right here. Either way, you probably need to get up for a stretch.